Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Michelle Dunn. I'm Executive Director of Franciscan Action Network. I'm so happy to greet all of you and have you here tonight for our Lenten program, Preparing Our Hearts to be Peacemakers. As we gather and as people are continuing to come into the Zoom call, please feel free, in fact, very welcome, to put your name and where you're joining from in the chat so everyone can get a feeling for who's in this room together tonight, this discussion. Oh, I see Sister Kathy from San Diego. Brother Ken is here. Thank you so much. From so many names coming in now, from Madison, Wisconsin, from San Antonio, from Connecticut, Fremont, Michigan. Sister Maria from Sister Marianne, Hartford, Connecticut, Evanston, Illinois. I can't keep up with reading all of them, but it's really so exciting to see people joining from so many different places. I can see we're together coast to coast tonight for this conversation. So, to get started a little bit, I've been thinking what a year 2024 seems likely to be. We're facing brutal ongoing wars in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, several other places around the world. We have, of course, an ongoing epidemic of crime and gun violence inside the United States. And then there are our very contentious politics and national elections that are, already coming up. And I think, a lot of concerns around, how is that going to go? Is this going to be another difficult year for us as Americans? And now here we are in Lent, a time to look within, to pray, to fast, to give alms, and also maybe a time to ask ourselves how we, the Franciscans, the Franciscan-hearted, the Francis-curious, how are we to get through this year? How are we know as followers of Jesus, in the footsteps of St. Francis of Assisi, that we are to be peacemakers. But the question is, how? How can we do that now? So let's discuss that tonight. We have two wonderful speakers to get us started off, get us thinking in this discussion. One of them is Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld from the Carnegie Endowment from International Peace, a specialist on political polarization and political violence around the world. And we also have with us a leading Franciscan scholar, Father Michael Cusato, who is currently at St. Bonaventure University. So we're going to then have a chance to discuss this with each other in small groups. But as always, we start in prayer. And so I would like to invite Aaron Buckley of the Franciscan Justice Circle at Siena College to lead us in an opening prayer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us from all over the country. Let us remember we're in the holy presence of God, wherever we may be tonight. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. We walk this Lenten journey with immigrants and refugees, lost, unsure of their journey's end, still longing for a home. We walk with those in poverty, unable to live lives of dignity, besieged by hunger and fear, trying to hold on day by day. We walk with those mourning what is happening to God's creation, calling us all to better care and stewardship of the earth, its creatures, and all growing things. We walk with women who are trafficked, who are abused, who are harassed, who are still in the silences, and who want to flee the darkness. We walk with peacemakers, walking a very rocky road toward peace when so much conflict ranges and so many fan the flames of violence. We walk with those carrying burdens, yet we walk in faith and hope. Despite the suffering of the cross, we walk toward an Easter dawning. we move toward the seemingly impossible resurrection, a time of justice and peace. We walk, calling forward through the darkness by the risen Christ. In his name, we pray. Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Aaron. We're going to begin by hearing from Rachel Kleinfeld. Rachel is a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. She's a widely published and widely cited expert on democracies facing problems such as social polarization, violence, corruption, and poor governance all over the world, and also similar issues that we've had here in the United States. So I invite you now to please watch my interview with Rachel on the current situation in the United States. Welcome, Rachel Kleinfeld. I'm so happy that you could be with us this evening. We're as I hear Americans speaking about this year, and particularly the political season that has already well begun, I hear people speaking about it with a bit of dread. It's not only that a lot of people are maybe not satisfied with the candidate selection, maybe some are, but also because they're maybe the same candidate as in 2020, a lot of people are concerned about social polarization returning in a big way, the tensions, and even possibly the violence that we saw taking place around the 2020 elections. You are an expert on social polarization and political violence worldwide. And I know you're watching what's going on in the United States very closely. So, are people right to be so worried, or what do you see happening this year? What are the trends that you're observing?
Well, first, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. I wish I could be there in person. I think I and all of us could use a little more prayer right now, particularly those of us working in the democracy space. It's probably going to be a tough election. And I don't want to sugarcoat that, although I also don't want people to take that to mean there's nothing they can do. There's a lot people can do. But I have a group of about 75 researchers who all study targeted violence in the United States, and we came up with a document of what do we expect this year. And some of it is already happening, the polarization around the war in Israel and Gaza and the anger that's leading to. But then specific to this election, what we're seeing is a candidate who has a tendency to demonize his opponents, and that can lead to threats against those opponents, threats against journalism when journalists are seen as one of those opponents, threats against groups that are demonized, like immigrants, who we can expect to see, I think, really facing some difficult times as the campaign season heats up and the rhetoric heats up as a result. We're seeing that the polarization of both sides of the political spectrum is very high. The violence tends to be higher on the right, but it's also higher against people on the right. So we're seeing a lot of violent threats against moderate conservatives. Actually, that's the largest group of violent threats is against moderate conservatives who are state legislators or members of Congress or their family members who aren't giving in to this kind of anti-democratic or violent rhetoric. And so those of us who are tracking political violence are concerned, but it's important to say we shouldn't expect another January 6th, that that kind of violence, a big mass event to stop the changing of the guard, as it were, you see that when an incumbent leader is threatened. It's a very common thing in weak democracies, almost never in democracies like the United States, but in weak democracies, if an incumbent leader who has control of the apparatus of government is threatened, you see a big mass event like that. What we're seeing in America right now is this slow drip, and it's easy to ignore it's easy to not notice that 1/5 of our officials who administer our elections, who are mostly women in their 50s and 60s, are getting threatened on an off year of an election. But that's happening. It's just quiet. And because it's quiet, people aren't realizing that that's causing people to leave their jobs and so on. So we're seeing that, and people should take it seriously, even though it's not the spectacular made-for-TV images that we saw in 2020.
Rachel, I want to return for a moment to something that you mentioned about dehumanizing speech. You did a wonderful program for us 2 years ago during Lent about that, about the dangers of dehumanizing and demonizing speech and the connection to political violence. Could you remind us of that, unpack that
Sure.
a little bit, and tell us what we should be looking out for in our own speech and in the speech that we tolerate and normalize in our circles?
It's such a great question, because this really gets to the essence of what we all live with. Most of us are not out there on the hustings with a weapon, but all of us have a mouth, and we sometimes use it in a way that is less than charitable. And so what we've learned about dehumanizing speech is that it's very hard to get most regular people to commit violence against other people. Most people have been socialized from a very young age to not be violent against other people. That can change if they're seen as protecting their community against a threat, and particularly if it's a threat that's not human. So we have an ant problem in my house right now. I have no problem killing lots of ants in our house as they're getting all over the cat food. Most people have the same feeling. When you start comparing people to ants, to vermin, to other dehumanized words, groomers instead of lesbian or gay person or what have you, these words dehumanize. And what they do in our brain is they take people out of the category of other human being, and they put them in a category of object. And that makes it much easier to commit violence. Now, if you pair that dehumanization with a sense of threat, so that you're protecting against that dehumanized threat, then it becomes much easier for regular people to commit violence. And so when you say that immigrants are coming into our country as a horde, and you use various words to dehumanize a caravan or what have you, and then you start talking about the threat that those individuals pose, that gets people willing to act. And we've seen from genocidal regimes to one-on-one violence of disturbed individuals or more aggressive individuals or more impulsive individuals, that speech has real consequences. So it's very important to guard against it. The other thing to guard against is jokes. And I don't mean to be a killjoy, the last thing that we need, we could use more humor in our lives, but jokes get around our defenses that, oh, of course, I wouldn't dehumanize anyone. I wouldn't be violent. That's not who I am. But then you see a little meme showing, a picture of something that you agree with, your disliked political candidate being drawn and quartered, and you send it around. Well, that actually kind of sidesteps people's rational brains, and it makes it much more easy to normalize violence. So those are the things to kind of watch out for.
Yeah, I think that phrase normalized violence is really important, because I think that in many cases, people wouldn't commit violence themselves, but they might kind of shrug if others commit violence against a group that has already been demonized or painted as a threat, in their eyes. So we're talking a lot about violence, but um, do we really have to? Aren't there ways we could be reweaving the social fabric?
Yeah, another great question. This violence that's in the American polity, we've always had it. It's not that it's new. It's just rising to a pitch right now. And part of why it's rising to a pitch is that we've really forgotten a lot about what binds us together. If you look at people's behavior in terms of belonging to groups, Putnam started talking about this more than 20 years ago with his bowling alone thesis, that fewer people were joining bowling leagues. But we've seen that just plummet across every single organized group, including religion, of course, that people are not belonging. They're not joining things. They're not remembering what it's like to just have to get along with people that you agree with, maybe in one aspect of your life, but not in all aspects of your life, which is what one does at the best churches and synagogues and bowling leagues and unions and even workplaces. Since COVID, a lot of us don't go into our workplaces and also don't have to deal with just that rubbing up against one another that we learned how to tolerate in past generations and years. And so remembering what it's like to live with that amount of tension with someone else, that you can enjoy certain aspects of someone and still live with a little tension, is a really important practice, almost like a meditative practice, to reweaving democracy. Because America is an experiment. We're an experiment. We've been around more than 200 years, almost 250, but there's never been a democracy that's been on this scale for this long. We are an experiment that is constantly at the edge of what we can achieve. And right now we're trying to achieve a real change in terms of racial and gender dynamics quite quickly. I was just looking at these stats, from 1810 to 1960, whites were between 85% and 86% of the American population. We actually went up in that period of time. And then after 1960, there's just a big drop. It's a very fast change. And it's not surprising that people are having trouble taking that in. And I think our democracy will get past this moment. We'll get past the moment of backlash against women. We'll get past a lot of the nastiness that we're seeing now. But it's hard for people. We need to give them some grace that they can get there. And we need to give our country a sense that there's room for all of us, and that if we trigger each other a little less, we can sort of land this plane safely. Right now, unfortunately, we're sort of sticking salt in the wounds on both sides, I think, and that's creating a lot of triggering and just a lot of tension. And as you said, we need to reweave the society. We need to get more used to being with people that we disagree with a little.
You've mentioned, democracy a few times, and as people of faith, I often like to sort of recall that, well, what is it for? And it's for, I think one of the things it's for is resolving political problems nonviolently. Work out the inevitable conflicts and the way things have to be divided up. Now, it doesn't always work perfectly. In fact, it hardly ever works perfectly. But it seems as though we're kind of at a place where a lot of people at different parts of the political spectrum and in different age groups are not appreciating democracy very much, or not valuing it, maybe not feeling grateful for what we have in this country, this way of working out issues. So I'm curious, what you think about that, and whether appreciating what we have in a functioning democracy, and maybe being grateful for other blessings as well. How does this figure potentially into this very fraught moment politically and socially?
Grateful is such a beautiful word for this and so important. You and I have both worked in a lot of countries that don't have democracies. And, democracy is such an abstract noun. Or abstract verb. Some of us think it's a verb, you need to do it. But, it's not concrete. People don't really know what it means, and it doesn't have a lot of emotional content. But, it does is war. War has a lot of emotional content. People know what that is. And you're absolutely right. The whole reason we have a democracy is because we have over 300 million people in this country. We have very big differences of opinion. I mean, I don't even agree with my husband about a great number of things. So I'm not going to agree with 300 million other Americans. How do we work out those differences? We vote. That's how we work out our differences. Other countries have other means of working out their differences. And for a lot of them, that's open warfare. And that is a really ugly way of working out differences, a really a way that ensures poverty, a way that ensures a lot of harm to just regular people, children, and so on. So we don't want that. So whatever you think about this abstract noun of democracy, it's a heck of a lot better than trying to solve our differences through warfare. And I think that's really, people need to think about that, because some people think, oh, well, there's a third option. There's some form of a leader who just makes their own decisions or makes good decisions. But, my good decision on the climate that I impose on you is your good decision on abortion that you impose on me. And pretty soon we're back to warfare, because we don't agree about what those good decisions are. And so I think some gratitude for what we have is really important. I often think I've got a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they are not particularly grateful for the nice middle-class life that we give them. And I sometimes think, I'd like to just airdrop you children down in some of the villages I've been in, and you can see what it's like to be a child in another place where life is a lot harder. And there are times I want to take the entire American populace and sweep them up and just say, look, you want to see what democracy is good for? Let me drop you in a country that doesn't have it. And you'll see what it's like to live in a place where you're afraid to voice your opinion, where you can't be honest with your children, because if they voice their opinion in school, you'll find somebody knocking on your door, or where you're living in real fear. And then you'll probably start appreciating it a lot more.
I'd like to turn, Rachel, to what people of faith can do in a situation like this. I was had a talk recently by a Secretary of State who supervises elections in a state where there has been some tension and even violence, at polling places. And found what she said really fascinating. She said that people of faith, whether they're clergy or other people of faith, were the single most important group she could think of to promote peaceful elections, to be present at polling places, to be speaking in a nonpartisan way. Just about the importance of keeping the peace and mutual respect and working out differences without violence and so forth. So I'm curious if you what you think about that, as a person who watches polarization and political violence in the United States and a lot of other countries. What kind of roles do you see people of faith playing that can be helpful?
There is so much that people of faith can do, and it's just incredibly important, because right now we're less divided by our actual beliefs. If you poll people, actually, there's a lot of agreement on even hot button topics, but we don't believe it. We're very divided in what we think the other side thinks. And what people of faith can do is what's called building a third identity. So we talk about, you're not a Republican or a Democrat, we're all Americans or what have you. That third identity can often backfire with some minority groups who say, but I want you to see me. I don't want you to subsume me in another group. But what we all are is people created in the image of God. And people of faith can see that, and that does not subsume any identity. And if they can see that and then express to each other that there's a reason to be a little more trusting of each other and a little bit more forgiving of each other, a little more grace in the process. There are some election mistakes. We have a very large and decentralized election. The vast majority of them are created by 50 and 60-year-old women who are trying to turn on the computer and having a little bit of trouble. I mean, these are not nefarious mistakes. There's a lot of people doing a lot of things. And so a little grace can go pretty far. I think people of faith who can communicate just a little more calmness. The social anxiety in our country since COVID has skyrocketed, and just taking it down a notch with some calm is really important. And who can communicate some trust. One of the things that we've seen in people who don't trust our institutions and so on is that they don't trust anything. It's not just that they're not trusting the elections. If you poll them and you ask, if your wallet is stolen, do you think you'll get it back? They're the ones who have the lowest scores on that. They don't think they'll get it back. So showing that there's some trustworthiness is really important. I think the other thing, just very practically, people of faith can do is show up, volunteer for things, and reassure, as long as the reassurance is legitimate. But I think it generally will be that, I showed up, I went to the polling place, I volunteered, I voted, everything looks good to me. And by the way, it's done here the way it's done most other places. Because one of the things we've found in the polling is that almost everyone actually trusts their own voting. What they don't trust is someone else's voting. And so they say, well, I think my vote was counted correctly, but I don't know what they did over there. Well, all 50 states, while they have very different voting people and so on, they have very similar procedures. They all have audits, they all have paper trails, they all have custody of ballots, so the ballot can't go amiss. And so those kind of basic reassurances people of faith should be able to give to others, and it would be tremendously valuable.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This is all terrific. I think thoughts for us to include, in our discussions as we think about, what is ours to do this year if we want to be peacemakers, which we know all Franciscan-hearted people do. So thank you so much, Rachel, and good luck to you, as I know you're incredibly busy this year. Your expertise is much in demand, and we really thank you for taking time to share some of it with us.
Well, thank you. You're doing incredibly important work. All of you are, and I'm just really grateful to get to talk with you for a little while.
Take care. Our second interview is with Father Michael Cusato. Michael Cusato OFM is a notable scholar of St. Francis and early Franciscans. He's currently a scholar in residence at St. Bonaventure Friary. In 2023, Father Michael published a new biography of St. Francis called Francis of Assisi, His Life, Vision, and Companions. And he mentioned to me that he's currently working on a translation from French of a notable biography of St. Anthony of Padua. So I asked Father Michael for his thoughts about what our Franciscan tradition has to offer to us, those of us who would be peacemakers. So please enjoy hearing what he had to say in response.
On to or comment on the act of peacemaking, or what might be called the art of peacemaking, I think it's important to consider the art from two simple perspectives. The first perspective concerns the peacemaker, him or herself, which is to say, the specifically Franciscan attitudes, mindset, or mentality each one of us brings to our concerns for future acts of peace and justice. The first perspective is focused on ourselves. The second concerns what it is we might do concretely, how we might put into action, if you will, what it is we are aiming to accomplish. So there's going to be an internal focus and an external focus. So let's start with the first perspective, the internal focus. To bring a specifically Franciscan perspective or mindset to things that we'd like to do, I think it's important to come with an overriding or undergirding framework, a foundational attitude, which is easier said than done. It was during Francis's encounter with lepers in 1205 outside the city of Assisi that he came to the cardinal insight of his life in spirituality. It was his insight into what I tend to call the universal fraternity of creatures, which translates into the simple foundational formula that all men and women, without exception, are brothers and sisters one to another. That is, that there is a fundamental, foundational commonality we all share, whether we are highborn or lowborn, educated or untutored, rich or poor, esteemed or despised, friend or foe. In other words, the Franciscan peacemaker enters each encounter with an attitude of fundamental respect, a shared commonality as human persons. something given by God to each one of us as a gift, and not earned by ourselves through our own attitudes and actions. With this fundamental respect in mind, each conversation we have must be styled as an encounter. I'm going to mention three aspects of this internal focus. The first aspect is what we enter into should be styled as an encounter, a two-way encounter, a chance to meet, listen to, learn from, and share and give witness to what we have within ourselves, what has been inspired within us by God and by our own human experiences. This is, of course, difficult in situations of antagonism, tension, and division, and even confrontation, but it is foundational for our conversation. It represents what we might call the Franciscan approach or the Franciscan heart of the individual peacemaker. So, commonality, we're all brothers and sisters of one another. Our conversations are styled as encounters. And thirdly, it obliges us to honor the mystery of conversion, or the process of conversion. Francis, I believe, came to understand that in such encounters, when one set out what is one's own perspective and shaped by our religious values, whether or not those words and attitudes penetrate or transform our listeners depends largely on whether God himself can find an opening into the hearts and minds of our listeners. It was only when Francis himself was ready to receive a different understanding and perspective about lepers, only when God could enter into his consciousness because of his debilitated stance as a sick person having returned from war, that could take place. And then, and only then, do our conversations take place and enter into dialogue. Our encounters are always two-way encounters as Franciscan makers of peace. That's all I really want to say about the internal focus, the mentality we bring to such conversations. Our second focus is on the external, what we can actually do in our art of peacemaking. Let me mention 5 short examples drawn from early Franciscan history, which do shed some light on various possible aspects of our work for justice and peace. The first is well known to most of us, the Franciscan perspective during the time of Francis on the use of money. Essentially, the Franciscan approach to not use money, to refrain from its use, to give no currency to currency, the early Franciscans perceived that coinage or money was a means of the powerful to exploit the poor, those who had no power. I'll spare you the dynamics of the medieval currency and how that took place, but it was basically a currency, a coinage that was devalued and debased. But at root, the Franciscan approach was a boycott. It was to boycott the use of money. It was really much less than making ourselves poor by getting rid of money. It was to boycott an instrument of the exploitation of the poor found in this debased coinage, that every time a poor person or any person, except if you were rich and powerful or an ecclesiastic, you went to the market, your money was worth less and less. Inflationary. boycott is a peaceful means of protest. A second example is Francis's encounter with the Sultan in Egypt in 1219. The desire for such an encounter probably had less to do with seeking martyrdom or converting the Sultan and other Muslims, as the hagiographical stories tell us, than it was an opportunity for him to live out very concretely his recognition that all men and women, without exception, were brothers and sisters, one to another, all come from the same creative hand of a creator God. And in this instance, it was even the most hated of Christian foes, the Muslim infidel, that Francis went to live among to show he was a brother to all. It also should be noted that I believe that Francis himself in this encounter, without going into the specifics of the encounter, of course, Francis himself was profoundly changed in this encounter. Whatever he went to the Muslims in his mind and in his heart, in terms of conversion or not conversion or whatever, one can certainly verify that he returned a profoundly changed man, that the Muslim person he encountered was not an infidel, an unbeliever. It was a person, a man or a woman, who had beliefs. Secondly, that there were many paths, legitimate paths, to finding God. And that thirdly, that it was love as a brother that was the transformative glue, if you will, of this encounter. A third example of a concrete act of justice and peace is the reconciliation that he urged between the mayor of Assisi and the bishop of Assisi in 1225, who were involved in a scandalous conflict in the town and between their partisans, which ended up to be an ugly stalemate in the town. Francis, as we know, sent 2 friars, one to each of the disputants, and urged them towards conciliation. I tend to like the word conciliate rather than reconcile, because it shows a bringing together, and the reconciliation that needed to happen would have taken place between the 2 men and their partisans. But it was in order to describe or to make sure that these 2 men came together that he sent these 2 friars to sing a new stanza that he had created for his Canticle of the Creatures, this one having to do with how blessed are those by God who will be crowned with the crown of peacemaker when they come together and reconcile one to another. And having done that, it was a very effective act of justice and peace on behalf of the poverello. Neither friar nor Francis were skilled diplomats. They were simply testifying to the vision of civic harmony and peacemaking and the tamping down of the acquisitiveness that is within the hearts of many people in society, both then and today, that conflict was resolved. Now, after the death of Francis, we can point within 5 to 7 years of his death in 1226. In the early 1230s, we have 2 very interesting examples of attempts to make peace in our society, in the society of its day. We have the example, for example, of Anthony of Padua, who preached what is called the Great Lent of 1231. And when he went around for 40 days and preached in different places every day to different crowds of different social strata in the town of Padua. And it was a predominant theme of the Great Lent, that those who had the power and authority to do so, that they needed to take care to make sure that the problem of the poor, and especially the poor who fell into debt, was transformed and alleviate it. And he kept urging them, you need to change your onerous legislation in your town to make sure that the man, particularly the man who falls into debt and is immediately thrown into prison, and therefore the family unit is deprived of its breadwinner, that something is done to alleviate that situation so that the one who has fallen into debt will be treated fairly and justly, as will his family. Similar to that, after his death in 1231, 2 years later, in 1233, a number of Franciscan friars, much more skilled than the early friars were, decided to go throughout the various communes in northern Italy, and they basically hired themselves out and were hired by the communal authorities to sell this perspective. In other words, they were given full authority in these various cities to transform, to change, to rewrite the statutes on the books in favor of justice for the poor, especially for poor debtors. It's a very unusual page of Franciscan history. Few of us are trained in diplomacy or in the art of legislating, but this handful of friars did just that, having been entrusted with power to do so, and they changed the fabric of the way these various communes, at least for a time, dealt with the oppressed poor. It's a good example of one of the things that we can keep in mind, depending on our training, of what we can do in our work of justice and peace.
Father Michael, thank you so much. That was really very inspiring. And I do have a couple of follow-up questions
Sure.
for you.
Yeah.
You have a few more minutes. So one of them was, I really appreciated the internal focus of being a peacemaker, and then the external focus of what can be done. On the internal focus, I was struck by something you said about God only being able to work with us if there's an opening, so to speak. If I understood you correctly, you spoke about Saint Francis's woundedness.
Mm.
Really, I mean, he was physically and maybe psychologically as well wounded, by his imprisonment, and that and that did open him up, to God. So I was thinking about that, and about what do we need to do as individuals to recognize our own woundedness, and maybe see the woundedness of others as well, those brothers and sisters with whom we might engage in dialogue, and including those whom we see as quite different from ourselves, whether that's politically, socially, or other ways.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of today's society, and the political divisions, which are so deep and so almost impenetrable. And I was left to basically trying to use the Franciscan story as my basis to assert that our mission in this encounter is to give testimony to what God has placed and we have assimilated from our perspective on justice in society. It is our primary focus in such dialogues, encounters, to present and give testimony to our perspective in why it is we believe and have been led to believe, on the basis of the gospel or on the basis of our founder and heroes in the Catholic social tradition, how it is we have come to that. the great mystery is though sometimes we expect that somehow we're going to win the argument. And it's very often not the case that we win the argument, because the time might not yet be ripe for that person to receive the word that we're sharing, the testimony we're sharing. And that's the frustrating thing about entering into dialogue in situations that are fraught with tension and antagonism and political divide, and that from the story of Francis, his turnabout did not come when he came back from war. He was injured, he was ill, he had been in prison for over a year. His physical and mental condition were devastated, but it wasn't then that God could actually break through all of that. It was only when he was ready to receive it that it was the encounter with lepers. Suddenly, and the word I think is even used, suddenly opened his eyes. That was the transformative moment, but it was dependent upon the grace of God being able to work into him and open him up. And I think our difficulty sometimes with these tense encounters we have on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, is that people aren't quite yet ready to receive our perspective. We want to call it an evangelical perspective, but so that's the great challenge. That's why I call it a mystery of conversion, and there's a bit of humility that's involved there.
I hope you enjoyed those two interviews, and I hope you found them as thought-provoking as I did. So now we have a chance to discuss a little bit. What we're going to do is put you into breakout rooms. Our communications coordinator, Janine Walsh, is going to put you into small groups of 3 or 4 people. You're going to have 15 minutes in your breakout rooms, and we have 2 suggested questions for you. And they're related very much to the framework that Father Michael just presented. So the first question is, what internal work do I need to do to prepare to be a peacemaker? And the second question is, what gifts or skills can I bring to the external work of peacemaking in my community, my country, and in the world? Those questions are going to be in the chat. And when you get into your breakout rooms, as you know, you'll get a little invitation to join a breakout room. You'll click and join and go in. You can open the chat again. That's down. Click on chat down at the bottom of your screen. You'll be able to bring those questions up again. And so I just ask you to please be sure in your group that each person has enough time to speak. And please take note of the new insights that you're gaining. Please enjoy your conversations. Something that enlightened you, please feel free to put that into the chat, and we can share that with the other participants just in an informal way. I see people are still coming back in from the breakout rooms. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. We're almost at the end of our program, but as I was saying, if you have anything, and Ginny, and I hope you have turned on the chat again, if you have anything you would like to share, an insight, something you learned, something you heard from one of your conversation partners in your breakout room, please feel free to put that in the chat, share it with the other participants. As we draw near a close of the program, I wanted to mention some upcoming events of interest. On March 14th, Franciscan Action Network will hold a webinar with Palestinian and Israeli bereaved parents who are working together for reconciliation, even now amidst this very difficult war. You will receive an invitation to that event in the follow-up email that you get after this program. I also want to draw to your attention the Lenten ceasefire campaign. There's a group called Christians for Ceasefire that Van participates in, and there are events just about weekly. The next one is March 6th. but you can sign up for that event, and you can also sign up just to be kept updated on future events. I also want to mention a little bit further down in the calendar, FAN will be hosting an in-person book launch for the Reverend John Deere and his new book, The Gospel of Peace, on May 15th in Washington, D.C. And, please just stay in touch with us for the many opportunities that we hope to create during this year for all of us to act as peacemakers in our communities, in our country, and in the world. And finally, before we end this evening, I want to mention that we're missing someone this evening. We're missing someone very important who definitely would have been here with us this evening. And that is Brother Paul Crawford, a Capuchin friar who served as the president of FAN's board until he passed from this life last week. So I want to invite another member of the FAN board, Sister Melinda Pellerin. She's written a beautiful short tribute to Brother Paul, which will serve as our closing prayer this evening. Thank you, Sister Melinda.
Thank you, Michelle. Brother Paul D. Crawford can be most deeply expressed in an enduring prayer of humility, hope, love, and the epitome of service to others. His life, a prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of peace. Once in an interview, when asked what was his favorite prayer, Brother Paul said, Lord, make me an instrument of peace. And in another interview, when asked about entering religious life as a brother, Paul said, I saw a need to have a bridge between laity and religious life, so I entered. Brother Paul built bridges of healing and service to and for others. Brother Paul was an example of Jesus's prophetic gospel message. It was what we know best about Father Paul. It is the essence of his very being, a life, a sacred journey, a committed service to all, to be like Francis of Assisi. Brother Paul was. Saint Francis of Assisi once said, the deeds you do may be the only sermon some people will hear today. Everyone who encountered Brother Paul or worked with him would affirm that his life, his sermons were concern for others, journeying toward reconciliation, journeying toward peace and goodness. Brother Paul's sermons will be cherished and remembered, and we must carry them on. We who knew him and those who he served would say of him that Brother Paul recognized the poor and he profoundly embraced their needs. In his own humility, in a life of service to God, a life dedicated to the fight for social justice and the stewardship of all nature. We pray and we celebrate his life. Brother Paul touched our lives too, with his own brand of humor, with grace, with peace and goodness. His life is a prayer of extraordinary love, a justice-minded man, brother, modeled into the expression of Saint Francis and Saint Clare, following Jesus and the gospel. Brother Paul, always an instrument of peace, seeking to console and to understand. In our prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled, but to console, to be understood as to understand, to love as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Father, Abba, God, we celebrate the life of your servant. He was truly an example of St. Francis journeying in our world. In community activism, Brother Paul sowed peace and understanding. In doubt, in despair, in sadness and darkness, Brother Paul built a bridge of reconciliation, a bridge of justice and mercy. Blessed are those who endure in peace. Brother Paul, in giving what you received, you changed our lives for the better. You, our dear brother, understood the sacredness of the neighbor, the gospel message, the inspiration of both Saints Francis and St. Clare. You took that understanding and you walked in the world with us. You inspired us, and we are forever grateful. Your deeds were heard. Your deeds will be your legacy. Peace and goodness. Amen.
Thank you so much, Sister Melinda, for evoking our beloved brother Paul so beautifully. I thank you all for being with us. This is just one step. There are many, many steps I hope we will take together as peacemakers during this year. And we send you off with a greeting of St. Francis. May the Lord give you peace. Good night, and God bless you all.